When I touched the coffin lid, his eyes opened. I swear they opened.
Have you ever looked at a coffin and felt like it was still alive? It might sound absurd, morbid, or even sick, but I need to tell you what happened, because if I don't, it will continue to eat away at me. It will sound crazy, and that's okay if you think it is. But after you hear it all, you'll think twice before looking at a hand folded inside a funeral urn. My name is William. I worked as a gravedigger for over 14 years in Rhode Island. I've seen every kind of funeral, from silent wakes to burials that felt like family curses. And believe me, over time, death becomes a routine as cold as the ground we dig. But on that particular day, something broke that routine. And after that, nothing was silent for me anymore. It was a Tuesday. The sky was grey and overcast, as if the weather itself already knew what was about to happen. I was scheduled for a simple funeral for a middle-aged man named Thomas Hale. No grand ceremony, just a dark wooden coffin, a local priest, and maybe 5 family members at most, all of them with that distant look in their eyes, as if they wanted to bury more than just one body. So far, nothing out of the ordinary, until the moment the priest began to pray the final Our Father. And something, right there in front of me, made me stop breathing. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but even today, so many years later, I know what I saw. And now is the time to pay attention. Because from here on, everything starts to fall apart. Because from here on, everything starts to fall apart. If you want to hear stories no one else has the courage to tell, subscribe and stay with me until the end. St. Agnes Cemetery has always had a silence unlike any other. It wasn't just the silence of death, but the kind of silence that seems to listen more than be heard. It's in rural Rhode Island, surrounded by dark pines that sway slowly even when there's no wind. The fog always arrives early there and leaves late. Some people say the earth sinks faster because of the humidity. I never knew if that was true. I only know that the place was born with the smell of something unfinished. That day, the procession arrived late, and the coffin was brought closed from the hospital. I didn't see Thomas's face until the casket was lowered. He was a pale man with a very serene expression for someone rumored to have suffered sudden cardiac arrest while sleeping. His hands were crossed over his chest, as per protocol. But there was something strange about his fingers. They weren't fully extended, nor were they stiff. They were slightly curled, as if waiting for something. The family was incredibly quiet. No one was crying. A woman, who I assumed was the wife, kept her eyes downcast the entire time. 2 children, perhaps, with expressionless faces, and a man in a suit who kept glancing at his watch as if it were a nuisance in his schedule. Everyone was there, but no one seemed present. Father Michaels, now a certain age, began the final prayer. His voice trembled, not with emotion, but with exhaustion. He repeated the words with an automatic tone, as if he had buried so many strangers that the prayers had lost their weight. As he prayed, my gaze lingered on the wood of the coffin. It seemed to absorb every word spoken, as if the deceased were listening, and I, without knowing why, began to feel watched, not by the living, but by the dead. It was a cold sensation that crept up my legs, as if the ground wanted to pull me along. Something about that body didn't feel finished. And when I reached out to adjust a flower that had fallen from the arrangement, I realized it. His hand was not in the same position as when we lowered the coffin. Don't ask me how I noticed, but the old gravedigger senses the slightest movement, the slightest shift, like someone hearing the creak of a door in the dark. And that wasn't an illusion. It was the beginning of something that, no matter how much I wanted to bury it with him, would insist on resurfacing. And if you think that's disturbing enough, what I saw when I returned with the cement is the kind of thing that haunts anyone's sleep. At that moment, I said nothing. I just watched. His right arm was still folded across his chest, but his hand had slipped a few inches to the side, and it wasn't the kind of slippage caused by the coffin's movement or vibration. I know how to recognize when something is mechanical. This was different, subtle, but intentional. His fingers were a little more spread than before, as if relaxing or awakening. His thumb seemed slightly separated from the rest, and it sent a shiver straight up my spine. I forced myself to believe it was just my head playing tricks. I was already tired. The morning had been long, the cold was pressing, and sometimes the body deceives the vision when the mind is already expecting the worst. But the more I looked, the more certain I became that that hand hadn't been in that position just minutes before. I hid my unease and returned to the back of the cemetery where we'd left the finishing materials. The bucket of cement was already prepared, along with the shovel and the ceiling lid. I tried to focus on what I needed to do, mentally telling myself it was just another burial like so many others. But it was no use. The thought came back like a hammer. She moved. You saw. She moved. As I walked back, I felt a strange weight in the air, as if the atmosphere around the cave had thickened. The breeze that had previously blown through the trees had ceased. The sound of my footsteps became muffled, as if I were walking in a place suspended in time. And as I approached the edge, something inside me screamed at me not to look. But it's impossible to ignore when curiosity is accompanied by fear. When I stopped at the edge of the grave, I slowly lowered myself to begin the sealing process. And that's when I noticed something even more bizarre. The deceased's right hand, which had previously been at his side, was now completely upward. The fingers were semi-flexed, as if beginning to form a fist, a movement that had clearly not been there before. I froze. I stood motionless for a few seconds that felt like hours. I analyzed everything around me, looked around, took a deep breath and looked again. Nothing had changed. No one had approached. Nothing had touched the coffin. I knelt beside it, tilted my head to get a better look, and noticed a small scratch on the side of the inner wood near my hand. It was superficial but recent, as if a fingernail had scraped hard against it. At that moment, my mind went into silent collapse. I couldn't accept it as a coincidence, but at the same time, how could I prove it was real? Logic tried to convince me that it was all a combination of natural factors, rigor mortis, internal dislocation, residual muscle tremors. But my instinct screamed that there was something there that couldn't be explained. And it was in this internal conflict that I remained for minutes, until I heard the priest's voice calling me from afar. The family had already left. I was alone now, and I would have to finish the job, even with that hand staring at me, even without knowing if it would move again. With shaking hands, I began to seal the top. Every sound of the falling cement seemed louder than it should have, as if it echoed inside the grave. When I finished, I slowly stood up, ready to leave. But for some reason, I turned to look one last time, and what I saw didn't let me sleep anymore. What I saw when I turned to take one last look was an instant that stuck with me like a burned photograph, marked by something beyond reason. The grave was there, almost completely covered, but still with enough space for the deceased's face and chest to be partially visible. And in that moment, in that last look, that hand was different, not just out of position. It was raised. The fingers pointed directly at me. The arm had moved in a way impossible for a still body, the elbow slightly flexed, the wrist bent, and the index finger perfectly extended toward me, not bent, not trembling, extended, directed, firm. as if it were a conscious, deliberate gesture made by someone who wanted to make sure I understood. You. I saw you. My body froze, but not with fright. It was something deeper, more primal. It was as if my brain was trying to reject the image, as if it refused to fit it into logic. A body doesn't move on its own. A hand doesn't point in the afterlife. An arm doesn't overcome rigor mortis, only to silently choose you. But there it was. And even with all my years of experience, even with every grave I'd filled, I'd never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, so deeply invaded by something unseen, yet felt. The fear I felt wasn't of dying. It was the fear of being marked. I tried to convince myself it was the weight of responsibility, physical exhaustion, my imagination playing tricks after a hard day. But when I closed my eyes for a second, trying to reset what I was seeing and opened them again, the hand was still there. Nothing had changed. No one had moved. There was no wind. There was no shadow. There was only that pale hand, outstretched, silently accusing me of something I didn't even know what it was. I walked away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the grave, as if it might rise at any moment. When I reached the base of the nearby chapel, I could no longer pretend. I dropped the shovel to the ground, sat on the cold stone step, and rested my head on my knees. I didn't want to tell anyone. Not because I feared being called crazy, but because, somehow, I knew it wasn't over. And if I did, I'd be admitting that something had followed me back. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with the refrigerator light on, watching my own hand tremble on the table. The memory of that other hand haunted me. It was as if it was still raised, as if the gesture continued to exist even without the body. And deep down, something told me that this wouldn't be the last time I saw Thomas Hale. His name echoed in the back of my mind, as if engraved somewhere within my own fear. I knew I had sealed the coffin. I knew I had completed the burial. I knew everything was closed, buried, final. But if everything was really over, why then did I keep hearing that name when I closed my eyes? I spent days trying to forget that scene, burying the memory along with what was left of my peace. But as much as I wanted to move on, something inside me insisted on looking back. The image of that raised hand was no longer just a memory. It was a presence. I felt it with me in places where before there had been only silence. The creaking of doors at night seemed different. The reflection in the mirror sometimes took a second longer to look back at me. It wasn't fear of the afterlife. It was fear of having been chosen by it. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected call from the cemetery administrator. A problem with the grave. Something had happened. Nothing specific, but urgent enough to make me return. And when I did, the earth was intact. No signs of tampering, not a shovelful of dirt out of place. But there was something strange. On the newly installed marble headstone, someone had scratched a single word. I heard. No sign of forced entry. No cameras captured anything. No plausible explanation. Just that one word. If you think it all ends here, you're wrong. Because what happened when we reopened that grave, it wasn't human. And even if it had been, no one there was ready to see what we saw. But that's another story. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has also felt that cold. So don't turn away. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because the following reports aren't just stories, they're echoes of those who've been on the other side. And once you hear them, there's no way to pretend you didn't hear them too. Some graves don't just hold bodies, some hold voices. During my years as a gravedigger in southern Georgia, I saw everything a man can see before a closed casket. Genuine grief, silent pain, disguised indifference, and even those who wept out of obligation. but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the night I heard something coming from beneath the earth. And before you think it was an animal, a root snapping, or the sound of wind blowing against the crosses, listen to what I'm about to tell you, because that day I buried a young man who deep down seemed unready for burial, and after all that, I have doubts as to whether he was truly dead. His name was Ethan Marsh, 19 years old. He had a serious motorcycle accident outside school, spent 3 days in a coma, and according to doctors, his heart stopped completely on a sweltering Friday afternoon. There was no autopsy. There was no full wake. The burial was requested to be held at night, without ceremony, almost as if they wanted everything to be forgotten before daybreak, and I was assigned to execute him. That night, the atmosphere seemed heavier than usual. The air was thick, as if every breath was filtered by something invisible. I sensed, from the moment the hearse's tires touched the cemetery entrance, that this funeral wasn't going to be just another one. And I was right. What I heard a few hours later, alone, in the darkness of the cemetery, wasn't a sound from outside. It was from within. And when you hear something like that, something rising from the depths of the grave, there's no way it can be the same afterward. The cemetery where this happened is on the outskirts of a small town called Darien in southern Georgia. Isolated, old, and always a bit damp, as if the earth had never completely dried. Surrounding it were just a few gnarled trees and an ancient iron fence that creaked in even the lightest breeze. That night, the heat was unusual. Not a dry summer heat, but a strange, suffocating heat, as if the air wasn't circulating. The sky was moonless. Not a single star was visible. It was as if the world had decided to turn a blind eye to that burial. The young man's name was Ethan Marsh. I didn't know him, but from the conversation with the funeral home staff, I learned he'd been in a serious motorcycle accident on the way home. He'd been in a deep coma, intubated for 3 days. According to the records, he was confirmed brain dead and then stopped breathing. Completely, but there was something no one was saying out loud. The family seemed pressured to bury the boy urgently. The hospital released the body that same day. The burial was scheduled for a few hours later. No mass, no tribute, no public farewell. Everything was silent and rushed, and that is never a good sign. When the hearse arrived, it was a little after 8:30 in the evening. The funeral home had kept the casket sealed all the way to the edge of the grave. When we opened it, already at the limit of the opening time, I was the one who checked his face before the final closing. Ethan was a thin young man, his face unmarked, his eyes half closed, and that caught my attention. Not because it's unusual, but because his eyes didn't seem relaxed. They seemed to watch, even half closed, even dead. I bent down to check the pillow, adjust the lining, and it was then that I felt the first chill. His skin wasn't as cold as it should have been. Not warm, of course, but there was still moisture, and I'd buried more recent bodies that seemed frozen from the inside out. I didn't say anything. I just carefully closed the lid. His mother was about 10 meters away. She wasn't crying. She just watched. His father stood beside her, arms crossed, and a man in a suit who looked like a lawyer was overseeing everything with a restless, quick-moving gaze. It all happened so quickly that it seemed like no one there wanted that death to be remembered. But even if they wanted to, forget, some things are not buried so easily. When the burial ended, the administrator and the assistant gravediggers left quickly, as if they had a more pressing commitment than closing the night. I stayed to make the final round, as I always do. It was routine to check that the tools were put away, that the outdoor lighting was off, and that the gates were locked. This routine, for me, had always been automatic, almost a ritual. But that night, Each step seemed heavier than usual. There was no wind. There were no crickets, just the muffled sound of my breathing and the soft echo of my footsteps on the grass. As I passed Ethan's new grave, something made me stop. It wasn't a noise, it wasn't movement, it was a sensation, as if that section of land had a gravity of its own. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the mound of freshly turned earth, the sealed coffin more than 6 feet below. The silence was so thick it felt like any sound would be absorbed before it even reached my ears. Then it happened. 3 beats, dry, rhythmic, coming from below. My entire body froze. I tried to rationalize immediately. It could be a loose rock, some natural movement in the ground, or even an animal burrowing underneath. But before I could finish that thought, the second sound came, a slow, steady scratching, like nails sliding across wood. The kind of sound that sends shivers down your spine and instantly dries your mouth. I took a step back, but continued to stare at the mound of dirt. I wanted to believe I wasn't hearing it, but every fiber of my being told me otherwise. It was then that, almost without realizing it, I whispered, "Ethan?" I don't know why I did it. Maybe part of me believed that if he were alive, he might answer. But what came was worse than any verbal response. 3 more knocks, this time louder. I ran to the administrator's office and explained, as quickly as I could, what had just happened. He looked at me as if I'd lost my mind and let out a nervous laugh. He said there was nothing to be done, that opening the grave would require judicial authorization, that it would bring huge trouble to the city and the family. When I insisted, he turned serious and said, "Don't get involved. These things only bring trouble to those who want to help." I left feeling more uneasy than when I arrived. I tried to speak to the funeral home contact, but the attendant responded coldly, saying there was no way there was any sound coming from inside, that the body was already in a state of no return, and that the conversation should end there. I called the hospital where Ethan was being treated, and a nurse, upon hearing his name, paused for a moment before saying she couldn't comment on the case, and abruptly hanging up. I was left alone with that uncomfortable truth. If there was life down there, no one was willing to admit it, perhaps for fear of scandal, perhaps for something even worse I couldn't imagine. I returned home, trying to push the images from my mind, but that sound kept replaying in my memory. The knocking had a rhythm. It wasn't random, and the scratching, it seemed to have a pattern, as if it were trying to write something into the wood. When I closed my eyes that night, I didn't see Ethan's face. I saw only the darkness of the grave, and from within it, the dull sound of someone who hadn't yet finished breathing. And it was in this unsettling silence that an idea began to form. An idea that wouldn't leave me alone until it was completed. The thought that haunted me all night gave me no rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if the pounding still echoed beneath my feet. It wasn't just the memory of a sound, it was its presence, as if it were still happening somewhere I couldn't see, but could feel. By 2 in the morning, I knew I wouldn't sleep. At 2:40, I was dressed, flashlight in one hand and a long iron pipe in the other. I didn't take my cell phone. I didn't bring a radio. I didn't want witnesses, no questions. This would be a conversation between me and whatever was down there. The road to the cemetery seemed emptier than ever. The streetlights barely illuminated the path, casting distorted shadows on the asphalt. As I passed through the iron gate, the sound of the world seemed to vanish. No wind, no leaves, no animals, just that dense silence which seemed to absorb even the sound of my breathing. I approached Ethan's grave with slow steps, feeling the stifling heat that still lingered in the air even at this hour. I stopped less than a meter from the mound of earth and shined my flashlight. The ground looked exactly as it had the night before, unmarked. The surrounding grass was still, as if painted on the ground, I took a deep breath, positioned the iron pipe over the exact spot where the coffin should have been, and knocked once. The sound reverberated hollowly, deeply. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. I waited. Silence. When I raised the pipe for the third knock, I realized my hands were sweating so much I could barely hold it straight. I knocked. What came next wasn't an echo. It was 3 knocks, in time with mine, coming from within. Not simultaneous, not delayed, at the same interval as if a conscious response. The impact ripped through me. My entire body wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. I stood still, flashlight trembling in my hand, staring at that mound of earth as if it might split. Open at any moment. I put my ear to the floor, unsure if I really wanted to confirm what I was hearing. And then I heard the scratching sound again, fainter than the night before, but constant. It was as if fingernails were dragging patterns across the wood, like someone trying to write something that will never be read. My heart was beating fast, but not with panic. It was a mixture of fear and a strange urgency, as if I had to do something right then. I wanted to knock back, ask if he could hear me, but before I could muster the courage, the sound stopped. It didn't fade. It stopped suddenly, as if cut off. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to fill the air. I stood up slowly, without taking my eyes off the ground. Part of me wanted to stay there. Another part wanted never to return. In the end, I did what any man alone and without answers would do. I left, but carrying with me the certainty that the story wasn't over. And deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. The next morning, I returned to work as if nothing had happened. I kept to my routine, greeted my colleagues, and pretended to be rested. But deep inside me, every step I took across that soil was accompanied by a memory that wouldn't go away. I avoided Ethan's grave until it was no longer possible. When I finally approached, I realized something had changed. Not in the earth, not in the grass. On the newly installed headstone, someone had scratched a single word into the marble base. I heard. The letters were irregular, but deep enough not to be erased by rain or time. I asked the other staff if they had seen it. They all denied it. The administrator told me not to mention it to the family and to treat it as common vandalism. But I knew better. There were no signs of a break-in, no sign that anyone had been there overnight. The cemetery's security, which rarely works well, mysteriously failed to capture any images that morning. It was as if the space between my visit and the next morning had been erased from the world. Days passed, but the case remained. Every Monday, around 3 in the morning, someone swears they hear knocking coming from that direction. I never checked again. Not for fear of what I'd find, but for fear of confirming that Ethan was still down there, waiting. If you've made it this far, you know that some stories don't end with a burial. There are things that continue, silently, underground. And if you want to hear what hasn't yet been told, subscribe. Now and turn on notifications, because with each new story, we'll delve a little deeper, and you need to decide how far you're willing to listen. There are things we see at work that should never be taken home, but sometimes, no matter how hard you try, they follow you. I've been a gravedigger for years, seen bodies in every possible state, grand ceremonies and solitary burials, and I've learned to keep my mind shielded, or at least I thought I had, until the day a single gesture, an impossible movement, made everything I believed about death begin to crumble. I've been told that the mind is capable of creating illusions to fill in the blanks. That stress and fatigue can trick perception. I've even repeated this to younger colleagues when they saw something strange. But when you're the one seeing it, when you're the one feeling that chill down your spine, these explanations ring hollow. That's exactly what happened that cold afternoon at Cedar Hill Cemetery in Connecticut. I was there to do what I'd done hundreds of times before, but I ended up taking home a memory that to this day wakes me in the middle of the night. It all started simply. A coffin, some relatives, a priest, nothing different from anything I'd seen before. But that day, there was something about the way the body was laid, something about the position of the hands, that seemed to beg to be noticed. I tried to ignore it, tried to follow the routine, but the feeling that something was about to happen clung to me like a weight. And it was in that moment, as I tried to convince myself that everything was under control, that I noticed the first detail so small that it could be overlooked. But that ended up changing everything. Cedar Hill Cemetery has always had a strange, almost uneasy silence. It's not the natural silence of a secluded place, but a dense silence that seems to absorb sounds before they even reach the air. In late autumn, when the cold wind carries the scent of damp leaves and the sky is covered in heavy clouds, this silence becomes almost oppressive. That day, as I walked through the main gate with my tools in hand, I noticed the atmosphere was even more charged than usual. The air seemed heavier, as if something were hovering between the tombstones. The deceased's name was Richard Barnes, a middle-aged man who, I was told, died of a massive heart attack while reading in his home office. There was no indication of violence or mystery in his death, but there was a strange heaviness among those present. His wife, a woman with a hardened expression, stood without shedding a tear, staring at the coffin as if facing a sentence. Beside her, 2 teenage sons, both heads bowed, avoided looking at the body. There was also an older brother who seemed more interested in controlling the timing of the ceremony than in paying his respects. The local priest, already advanced in years, began the prayer in a low voice as if reciting words that no longer carried the same fervor. The coffin was open, revealing Richard dressed in an impeccable dark suit. But it wasn't the suit that caught my attention. It was his hands. They were crossed over his chest, but not naturally. The fingers were slightly curled, as if about to move. It wasn't obvious, but for someone who has seen so many motionless bodies, any unusual detail jumps out. With every step I took around the grave, my eyes returned to those hands. I tried to look away, to focus on my work, but it was as if something in them called to me. Maybe it was just my imagination, maybe the angle of the light, but there was a subtle, almost imperceptible tension in the tendons beneath the pale skin, as if they were waiting for a command. And it was in this silent atmosphere, in which each second seemed to stretch longer than it should, that something happened. And I didn't know it yet, but that moment would mark the beginning of something I would never be able to fully explain. The final prayer began like any other. The priest kept his voice low and rhythmic, repeating words that blended with the distant sound of dry leaves rustling in the wind. I remained a few steps from the coffin, holding the shovel, trying to keep my mind on protocol. Still, my eyes kept returning to Richard's hands. It was as if something there didn't match the expected stillness of a body. That subtle curl in his fingers seemed more pronounced with each glance. Then it happened. In the middle of the prayer, while everyone else's eyes were closed, the little finger on my right hand twitched. It wasn't a sudden spasm, but a restrained, controlled movement. Like someone trying to move a dormant muscle. I felt my stomach sink. The air seemed colder, and for a second the sound around me was muffled, as if I'd plunged my head underwater. I couldn't blink. I couldn't look away. The only thing moving was that finger, and the certainty etched in my mind. I saw it. I tried to convince myself it might be a muscular reflex. It happens. I've seen bodies exhibit involuntary contractions before total rigidity, but there was something different here. The movement wasn't random. It was precise, and no matter how much I told myself it was just a natural phenomenon, the growing feeling in me was that Richard was trying to say something. My hands began to sweat, and the shovel I held grew heavier, as if absorbing the weight of the tension gripping me. I glanced discreetly at the family members. No one seemed to have noticed. The priest continued praying, oblivious to what had just happened. It was as if I had been the only one to witness it, and suddenly I felt isolated, as if an invisible line had separated me from the rest of the people in that room. For a moment, I considered moving closer to check, touching the hand, confirming what my eyes were showing me. But reason held me in place. Any unexpected movement would attract attention, and I wasn't ready to explain what I'd seen. So I remained motionless, watching the scene as if I were a spectator trapped in a movie that can't be paused. The finger stopped. It returned to its original position as if nothing had happened. But the image was etched in my mind, and no logical justification seemed satisfactory. I remained motionless until the end of the ceremony. But the feeling of being watched, even by a body that was supposedly no longer alive, didn't leave me. It was as if, behind my closed eyelids, there were eyes watching my every move. When the priest concluded the prayer, I felt a weight of forced relief. Protocol dictated closing the coffin, sealing it, and preparing for descent. But now, any approach felt like a provocation to what I had witnessed. I took a deep breath and with measured steps moved away to fetch the bucket of cement. I tried to convince myself that distance would help me regain my sanity. I didn't know that upon my return, what awaited me wouldn't just be a disturbing detail, but a change impossible to ignore, something that would make me question whether I really wanted to continue that work. The path to the tool shed seemed longer than ever. Every step I took was accompanied by the memory of the finger moving, and the more I tried to rationalize, the more that scene grew stronger in my mind. I grabbed the cement bucket and shovel, took a deep breath, and returned to the site. The distance between the shed and the grave was short, but that day, every meter I walked seemed to bring me closer to something I didn't want to face again. When I reached the edge of the grave, I instinctively looked at the coffin. I didn't want to, but my eyes were drawn to the same spot as before, Richard's hand, and that's when I realized it. It was no longer on his chest. Now it rested at his side, open, palm up, as if he'd been leaning against it to try to pull himself up. The change was impossible to ignore. It wasn't a subtle detail. It wasn't an impression caused by the light. It was a completely different position. My heart raced, and I felt a sharp chill run down my spine. My first reaction was to search for a logical explanation. Perhaps the movement of the coffin during its initial descent, perhaps a slight tilt of the body, but I quickly dismissed it. I had been there the entire time. The coffin hadn't been moved since the priest concluded the prayer. No one had approached, and even if they had, it would have been impossible to reposition that hand without everyone noticing. I paused for a moment, trying to decide whether to lean in for a closer look, or simply continue working and pretend nothing had changed. But there was something about that hand that wouldn't let me look away. It seemed not just out of place, but intentional, as if it were offering its palm, inviting, or worse, waiting for me to take it. I swallowed hard, glanced around to make sure no one was watching, and took a few steps closer. I could see more clearly the curvature of his fingers, slightly arched, as if the position had been assumed with effort. His skin seemed tauter, his knuckles more prominent. It was impossible not to feel that this gesture had a purpose, and that purpose was me. I took a step back and tried to focus on what I needed to do. I placed the bucket of cement to the side, grabbed the shovel, and prepared to begin sealing. But with every move, I felt as if that hand were following me with an invisible gaze. It was suffocating. Its presence was more intense than any other detail around me. I no longer heard the wind, nor the distant voices. only that heavy silence, as if the entire cemetery had stopped to watch what I would do. I gripped the shovel tightly, took a deep breath, and leaned forward slightly to begin the work. It was at that moment that a thought crossed my mind, with the clarity of a whisper. What if she moves again while you're watching? The thought made me stop in my tracks. I stood still, shovel in hand, watching. Nothing happened, at least not yet. But the feeling that something was about to happen wouldn't leave me. And it wasn't until I lifted the shovel, for the first load of dirt, that my mind began to implode. The shovel hung in midair, and for a moment I felt its weight come not just from the metal and earth I was about to dislodge, but from something deeper, almost invisible. I glanced at the coffin one last time before letting the earth fall, trying to dismiss it as ordinary procedure. But there was nothing ordinary about the scene. The hand remained open, motionless, and yet it felt as if, at any second, it might move again. I leaned forward to dump the first shovelful of dirt, and on an impulse I didn't understand, decided to look directly at Richard's face. Perhaps I wanted confirmation that everything was as it had been. Perhaps I expected to find only the still serenity of death. But what I saw made me hesitate. I don't know if it was the light filtering through the grey sky or something that actually happened, but the expression seemed different. There was a tension at the corners of his lips, an almost imperceptible arch of his eyebrows, small signs that together suggested something I didn't want to believe: consciousness. I backed away slowly, trying to control my breathing. The work needed to continue, but each shovelful of dirt felt heavier than the last, not from physical exertion, but from the weight of doubt that had now firmly settled within me. I finished the service in silence, certain that that burial had not only buried a body, but also something I could never explain. If you've listened this far, you know that some stories don't end with the last shovel of dirt. Some things continue, even in absolute silence. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next story will take you even deeper, to a point of no return. I've seen it all on this job. Desperate screams in the middle of a wake, coffins that creak as if the wood were alive, and even shadows crossing the chapel wall with no one around. But what happened that cloudy morning in Pennsylvania doesn't fit any of those memories. It's not a rumor, it's not an urban legend, and it's not something I heard from another gravedigger. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And to this day, more than 10 years later, I still wonder if what I witnessed was real, or if my sanity began to shatter at that moment. The funeral was for a woman respected by some and feared by others. The entire family attended, many dressed in traditional black, others in clothes that seemed to have come from an ancient ritual. So far, nothing unusual, except for the heavy silence that hung over everyone. It wasn't the silence of mourning. It was the silence of those who fear what might happen. At first, everything went as expected. The body was arranged, flowers surrounded the coffin, and the candles burned low as if afraid to disturb. But something inside me already suspected that day wouldn't end like the others. Maybe it was the way some family members looked away from the coffin. Maybe it was the quick murmur in a language I didn't recognize. Or maybe it was just the silent warning that, in a few minutes, I would witness something impossible to forget. And believe me, when we opened the casket at the ceremony, everything was perfect. But minutes later, she was no longer in the same position. The funeral parlor was small, with ancient wooden walls that seemed to absorb more light than reflect it. The tall windows, covered by heavy, dark curtains, let in only a pale beam of light, enough to cast long, restless shadows on the floor. The smell was a mixture of wilting flowers and burnt wax, an aroma that clung to my throat and seemed to want to settle in my lungs. Despite myself, My eyes roamed every corner, as if trying to anticipate what was to come, but all I found were tense faces, avoiding eye contact. The lady's family was large, but one particular group stood out. 3 women, all with colorful scarves tied around their heads, sat near the coffin. They didn't cry, didn't move, and rarely blinked. They seemed to be guardians of a secret no one there would dare question. When one of them looked directly at me, I had the strange sensation that it wasn't me she was seeing, but something behind me, or perhaps inside me. The priest conducted the ceremony in a lower voice than usual, as if afraid of drawing attention to himself. I'd known him for years and knew his posture that day wasn't casual. He avoided using the deceased's full name, referring to her only as our sister, or the one who departed. Something about that detail deeply bothered me. In the corner, a younger man, probably her grandson, held a wad of gold coins in his hand, twirling them between his fingers with almost hypnotic precision. Every now and then he'd put them in his pocket, but always pick them up again, as if he couldn't leave them alone for long. Later, I would discover that those coins held a meaning far beyond a simple token of farewell. But in that moment, caught between gazes that seemed to pierce me and a silence that no longer felt human, I began to sense something was wrong. And it wasn't just an impression. I just didn't know that later that morning, the image I would see as the coffin was lowered would make me question everything I believed about death and what might lie beyond it. The ritual began without warning, as if everyone there already knew the exact order of what to do. The 3 women with colorful scarves stood up simultaneously, moving in absolute silence, like shadows obeying an invisible call. One of them held a small embroidered cloth, another carried a plate with golden coins, and the third carried a small glass vial filled with a thick, dark liquid that gave off a metallic, slightly sweet odor. I had never seen anything like it at a wake, and though I wanted to ask, I realized there was no room for my voice there. With slow, precise gestures, they placed the coins over the deceased's eyes and crossed her hands over her chest, interlocking their fingers almost symbolically, as if each position held a hidden purpose. The woman with the vial then poured 3 drops of the liquid onto the woman's cold forehead, murmuring words in a language I didn't recognize. The entire room remained still, as if under the influence of a silent spell. Even the priest seemed more like a spectator than a spiritual guide in that moment. When the ritual ended, I felt the air grow heavier, as if something had been summoned and now lingered there, hovering between us. I knew many superstitions associated with funeral rituals, but I had never witnessed anything that caused me such physical unease. It was as if the body in the coffin was no longer just a body, but the dwelling of something that didn't belong to this world. A few minutes later, preparations began to close the coffin. The casket was sealed in front of everyone, and nothing seemed out of place. The coins were secure, the hands crossed over the chest, the expression serene. Everything was as normal as anyone would expect, but something inside me, an almost instinctive intuition, told me that this serenity wouldn't last. As we helped carry the coffin to the burial site, I noticed the 3 women sat back down, now side by side, without exchanging words, as if they were simply waiting for something inevitable. And indeed, the inevitable happened. Because the moment the casket began to descend, my eyes caught a detail that could not possibly have been there. A detail that made my entire body freeze and my heart beat wildly. And it was at that exact moment that I realized what I was about to see would make no sense at all. At least not for those who still believe that death is the end. As the coffin began to slowly descend into the grave, the late afternoon light filtered through the trees, creating elongated shadows that seemed to stretch out to touch the coffin. I was watching only to make sure everything was going as it should. but one detail made me tilt my head to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The body was no longer in the same position. At the moment of the closing, I distinctly remember her hands crossed over her chest and her face turned upward, but now the lady was on her side, as if she had turned inside the coffin. Her right arm was away from her body, slightly bent, as if she had been supporting herself to change position. Her face, previously serene, was now turned to the side, her mouth slightly open, revealing teeth that seemed darker in the dim light. My first impulse was to think it was just a memory error, that perhaps the position had been different and I hadn't noticed before. But then I saw something that eliminated any attempt at rationalization. The coins were no longer in her eyes. One was draped over her left shoulder, and the other rested at the bottom of the coffin near her feet. The ritual had been broken, as if the deceased herself had refused the rest they'd offered her. I felt the weight of a gaze, and when I looked up, the three women who had led the ritual were watching me intently. There was no surprise on their faces, no shock, no indignation, just that immobile expression, as if they had been waiting for this very thing. That detail made something inside me snap. It wasn't an accident, at least not for them. I tried to hide my nervousness and continue with the procedure, but as I grabbed the rope to lower the coffin, I noticed another chilling detail. The silk lining near my hands was wrinkled, with marks that resembled scratches, small parallel grooves, as if fragile fingers had scraped hard against the fabric. At that moment, the air around me seemed to close in, and the sensation of being watched intensified to the point where I felt a sharp chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't just the fear of seeing something impossible, but the nagging awareness that if I stood there a second longer, I might see the impossible happen before my eyes. It was then that I realized the worst hadn't yet begun, because there was one last detail inside that coffin that no one, absolutely no one, had noticed. Yet, as I finished covering the last of the earth, I noticed my hands were shaking more than usual. It wasn't just the weight of the shovel, nor the physical exertion. There was something else, something seeping into my skin like a chill that didn't come from the wind. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at that newly raised mound of earth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still moving inside. It was irrational, I knew, but the image of the overturned body and the coins on the floor of the coffin seemed to have stuck in my mind like a rusty nail. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion and suggestion. As I gathered up the tools, I noticed a detail that had previously gone unnoticed. In the corner of the hole, right at the edge, there was a small groove, as if something had pressed the earth from the inside out. I leaned in to get a better look, and I swear for a moment I thought I saw the earth move slightly, as if it were breathing. My heart raced, and an almost uncontrollable urge made me want to pick up the shovel and dig it all up. But at the same time, something stronger, a self-preservation instinct I couldn't explain, stopped me. I felt as if anything I did from then on might awaken something better left dormant. I took a few steps back, keeping my eyes fixed on the grave, and realized that the silence of the cemetery had become oppressive, heavy, almost liquid. There was no wind, no sound of crickets or crows, only an emptiness that seemed to hear my thoughts. I turned to leave, but before crossing the gate, I glanced over my shoulder once more, and there, at the edge of the freshly turned earth, one of the coins was glinting in the dim light of the street lamp. I didn't approach. I just continued on my way, knowing that this night wouldn't end for me when I got home. If you want to hear more real and disturbing stories like this, subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications and stay up to date with the stories that almost no one has the courage to tell, but that you need to know.